Assalamualaikum student, welcome to the University of Education Lahore, Department of English and the course Semantics and Pragmatics, which is offered in BS English. Code is ENGL3126 and you already have started the course and you must have covered a lot many topics. So let's start with today's lecture. Starting with the course text says, as we know, modern linguistics is one of the most exceptional scientific revolutions of the 20th century. It is related to the linguistic studies where the original focus from prescriptive grammar and the purpose of improving how people write and speak shifted to the idea that a language can be viewed as a self-contained and structured system which is situated at a particular point in time. Pragmatics is a subfield of linguistics which studies how people understand and produce a speech act in a concrete speech situation. Deixis belongs to the idea of a pragmatics because it directly involves the relationship between the structure of language and the context in which it is used. So we are going to discuss dyactic expressions as well. So by giving different definitions given by different linguists, we will try to define deixis. The definition goes like, deixis belongs to the area of pragmatics because it directly involves the relationship between the structure of language and the context in which it is used. And the definition is given by Levinson. Pragmatic awareness is regarded as one of the most challenging aspects of language learning, and it often comes through experience. Dyactic expressions fall into the following categories: person deixis, spatial deixis, temporal deixis, social deixis, and discourse deixis. So the definition of deixis goes like, the use of a word or phrase whose meaning depends on who is talking, who they are talking to, and where they are, etc. For example, me, here, or yesterday. So the term's etymology comes from the Greek word which means pointing or show. So deixis is referenced by means of an expression whose interpretation is relative to the usually extra-linguistic context of the utterance, such as who is speaking, the time or place of speaking, the gestures of the speaker, the current location in the discourse. The kinds of deixis are discourse deixis, emphatic deixis, person deixis, place deixis, social deixis, and time deixis. We will explain it further in the lecture. The noun deixis has come and has its origins From the Greek word, we all know that every language needs diaxes because there are differences. There are not universal diacritic expressions. Diaxis describes the function or use of diacritic words, forms, or expressions in the linguistics. So, diaxis is the process of pointing through language, and its denotation changes from one discourse to another. We can add more to it that it is usually needed to use gestures with diacritic words like this one here or that one there. However, diacritic words can also have the same pointing function without using gesture, which is called the canonical situation of utterance, as is called by Lyons. So we know that there are main three types of diaxis: person diaxis, place diaxis, and time diaxis, which we will elaborate and discuss further in the lecture. So diaxis, as we know, is the single most obvious way in which the relationship between language and context is reflected in the structure of languages themselves is through the phenomenon of diaxis. The term, it is borrowed. So essentially diaxis concerns the ways in which languages encode or grammaticalize features of the context of utterance or speech event, and thus also concerns ways in which the interpretation of utterances depends on the analysis of that context of utterance. So the pronouns this does not name or refer to any particular entity on all occasions of use. Rather, it is a variable or placeholder for some particular entity given by the context, that is through gesture. And the fact of diaxis should act as a constant reminder to the theoretical linguistics of the simple but immense important fact that natural languages are primarily designed, so to speak, for use in interaction, spoken interaction, and thus there are limits to the extent to which they can be analyzed without talking or taking this information into account. The importance of diacritic information for the interpretation of utterance. So, although perhaps can be illustrated through when such information is lacking. So the known types of diaxis are, as we already have talked about it as well, person diaxis honorifics, spatial or place diaxis, diacritic projection, psychological distance. Another type is temporal diaxis, diacritic expressions, psychological basis of temporal diaxis, distance and tenses, and diaxis and grammar. These are different available types of diaxis. A well-known dictionary defines diaxis as it refers to such phrases and words that can't be fully understood without any contextual information or reference. So, this depends upon speaker, time and space of speaking, as we already have mentioned, gestures, locations and topic about which the talk is going on. So a dialectic expression or diaxis is a word or phrase such as this, that, these, those, now, then, here, which points to the time, place, or situation in which a speaker is speaking. So diaxis is expressed in English language by way of personal pronouns, demonstratives, adverbs, and tense. For example, this is toy. Diaxis is a speaker-centric notion, that is to say, a speaker uses diaxis and dialectic elements while producing language. These dialectic elements' meanings come from the speaker and his or her location, time of speaking the utterance, and position of the utterance in the discourse. So the term dialectic expression comes from a Greek word which means pointing at. Lyons defines it as the location and identification of persons, objects, events, processes, and activities being talked about or referred to in relation to the spatio-temporal context created and sustained by the act of utterance and the participation in it, typically of a single speaker and at least one addressee. Dialectic expressions. As we are frequently faced with dialectic expressions in everyday language, whether consciously or unconsciously, in the way that we refer to persons, places, times, and various different other things. So, dialectic expression, their definition, categories, and types of uses. Dialectic expressions represent a key connection between the time, frame, space, and people involved. The word dialectic expression has its roots in the Greek word, which we already have mentioned to, that meaning to show. A related word, diaxis, is used in pragmatics and linguistics, and it refers to a process whereby either words or expressions are seen to rely utterly on context. Levinson argues that diaxis is the reflection of the relationship between language and context. Diaxis is an important field studied in pragmatics, semantics, and linguistics. Diaxis refers to the phenomenon wherein understanding the meaning of certain words and phrases in an utterance requires contextual information. Words or phrases that require contextual information to convey meaning are dialectic. So the contextual information of the utterance as is mentioned by Levinson in the previous slide, that consists of information about the speaker, the addressee, the time, and the place. For example, if we take a close look on the sentence that I'm leaving tomorrow, so here who does I am and tomorrow refer to? We cannot identify the meaning of this utterance unless we know the time of the utterance, the place, and who the speaker is. In other words, the context of the utterance. So expressions like I, you, we, this, that, here, there, today, tomorrow are all indexed, and the listener needs to identify the speaker, the time, and the place of the utterance to fully understand what is being said and meant. So there are three didactic categories which are identified in the literature. These are personal deixis, for example, I, you, and we. Spatial deixis, for example, this, that, here, there, and temporal deixis, for example, now, today, and yesterday. So we can add here that in addition to person, place, and time deixis, Levinson follows Leon and Fillmore, and they all add two other categories or didactic categories, which are social deixis, which covers the encoding of social distinction that are relative to participant roles, particularly aspects of the social relationship holding between speaker and addressee, or addressees maybe, or speaker and some reference, and discourse deixis, which involves the encoding of reference to portions of the unfolding discourse in which the utterance is located. If we go on further discussing about deixis, so we see that as opposed to Levinson, Yule describes deixis as a way of pointing through language, and also refers to deixis as a technical word that comes from Greek. Yule also admits that didactic expressions have their most basic uses in face-to-face spoken utterances. In addition, Lyons defined deixis as, by deixis it is meant the location and identification of persons, objects, events, processes, and activities talked about or referred to in relation to the spatio-temporal context created and sustained by the act of utterance and the participation in it, typically of a single speaker and at least one addressee. So in other words, an utterance containing didactic expressions such as I will move this chair over here This requires contextual information for an accurate meaning, which chair is being referred to, knowledge about the space, knowing where, that is here, and who the speaker is. So according to Levinson, an utterance can be tested as being didactic or not in terms of its truth conditions, as we have talked about truth conditions in other lectures as well. So, for example, if we say somebody knows a person, or the utterance can be either true or false, depending upon its truth condition, whether that somebody really knows somebody else that is mentioned, for example. So if we take another example, for that if I say that I will come and see you tomorrow, so we cannot assess whether this sentence is true or false because we are not aware of when the sentence was written or spoken. So therefore we do not know the when tomorrow is. So we can say that knowledge about the context in the interpretation of utterances containing dialectic expression, it is very crucial. So diaxis is organized in egocentric way, with the dialectic center constituting the reference point in relation to which a dialectic expression is to be interpreted. For example, in an utterance such as I am over here now, the speaker, the actual location and the actual time of the utterance are respectively the dialectic centers. The term dialectic center underlines that the dialectic term has to relate to the situation exactly at the point where the utterance is made or the text is written. Or in other words, we can say that it has to relate to the position from which the dialectic terms are understood. So in conversations generally, the dialectic center is constantly changing between the partners. The speech event is conceptualized from a different point of view. A dialectic expression, then we can say that it is a word or a phrase that point out the different meaning of words have in various situations. Without a pragmatic approach, the interpretation of an utterance would be impossible to understand. Therefore, dialectic expressions are crucial, and it involves the relationship between the structure of languages and the context in which they are used. So a word that depends on dialectic indicators, it is called a dialectic word, and it is bound to context. Therefore, we can say that words that are dialectic hold a denotational meaning which varies depending on time and or place and a fixed semantic meaning. This is an interpretation given by Levinson. So in addition to knowing the time, place and the speaker or the addressee, Dialectic expressions help us realize what is close to the speaker and what is not. This is defined by the following two terms: proximal, meaning near the speaker, such as this, here, now, and distal, that is away from the speaker, such as that, there, then. So this concept of distance is more relevant to the study of spatial diaxis. We have already elaborated in other lecture. Dialectic expressions also help us realize if the movement is away from the speaker or towards the speaker. For example, go or come. So we can add here Fillmore. According to him, most obvious manifestations of dialectic categories in languages are to be found in the systems of pronouns, that is, I, we, she, and demonstratives. For example, we know this, these, and tenses like walk or walked. Person diaxis localizes an entity in relation to the position of the speaker and or hearer. First and second person pronouns typically refer to the speaking and hearing speech participants, whereas third person pronouns designate the non-speech or narrated participant. According to Lyons, the active participants are the speakers and the addressee, whereas the third person is not an active participant in the speech act. Third person pronouns may be used diacritically or anaphorically. An anaphoric use of the dialectic expression occurs when reference is being made to another entity that was introduced earlier in the text or speech. For example, Bacon thinks I heard him. So this is an anaphoric use. If I say Bacon thinks or believes that the flower is beautiful, this is a dialectic use. So in English language, pronouns come in singular and plural form. Several are marked for case, and the third person singular forms encode gender. Another category of diaxis that we mentioned is spatial diaxis. Spatial diaxis localizes both the speech participants and the narrated participants in space. The most frequent words are the pronouns this, that, and these, those. Other expressions that belong to this category are the adverbs that we already know, here, there, and prepositions in, on. Spatial diaxis also entails whether something is near the speaker or not. For example, this or that. In all languages, there are pairs of verbs such as come, go, bring, take, which are interpreted to identify the direction of the motion towards or away from the place of speech event. Hence, the spatial diaxis is the marking in language of the orientation or position in a space. In one of his writings, Lyons has described that there are two ways in which we can identify an object by means of referring expression. First, by informing the addressee where it is. Second, by telling him what is like, what the properties it has, or what class of objects it belongs to. So, Fillmore also talks and refers about the fact that dialectic pointing can be achieved in different ways. He defines it or distinguishes between two types of uses, the gestural and symbolic ones. The gesture or gestural use requires proper monitoring the speech event in order to identify the referent, whereas the symbolic use involves activating knowledge about the communicative situation and the referent. Temporal deixis is another category of dialectic expression which refers to an event of an utterance which takes place anytime relative to the speaking time and is therefore represented by tense, time, adverbial, and sometimes by spatial prepositions such as in the evening, at midnight, on time. So the location of an event referred to and represented by time and tense constitutes the dialectic center in the utterance of a speaker. In English, the present and the past are morphologically marked. Morphology is an area of study that we already know falls in grammar, which describes how words are composed. A linguistic element is morphologically marked when it is more distinctively identified than another element by adding a morpheme. So a morpheme is the minimal unit of meaning, as we all know. For example, the first person present tense, I work, is not morphologically marked, whereas the third person, he work or he works, and the past tense, he worked, are marked by the morpheme S and ED. The future is constructed using the modal verb will. So another way to express the future in English is by attaching an adverb of time indicating the future, illustrated through different examples. Levinson in another place argues that complexities arises in the usage of tense, time and adverbs and other time dialectic morphemes wherever there is a departure from this assumption. For example, in letter writing or the pre-recording of media programs. Fillmore and Levinson, they note that dialectic words yesterday, today and tomorrow pre-attempt the absolute ways of referring to the relevant days. Thus, if we say the utterance that I will see you on Thursday, said on Thursday can only be referring to next Thursday. Otherwise, the speaker should have said today. If it is said on a Wednesday, the speaker should use tomorrow. So, in such cases, that dialectic words have referring or are relevant though, but the complexities also arise in the usage of the tenses as is mentioned by Levinson. We can once more talk about deixis as the users of a word or phrase whose meaning depends on who is talking, who they are talking to, where they are, etc. So, any linguistic form that we use to accomplish the task of pointing out is called deixis. The deictic words such as I, we, you, he, she, this, that, it, now, then, here, there, tomorrow, yesterday, etc. are different linguistic forms and are called deictic expressions. The meanings of deictic expressions can be understood only in terms of speakers' intended meanings. So when we indicate something, we use expressions. These expressions are called indexicals. For example, now, then, I, come, go, etc. And these expressions always require an addressee to be able to pick out a person, place or time relevant in understanding how the words refer, and this is called deictic reference. So the point of positioning of a speaker, it is called deictic center or deictic point. If a speaker is sitting at a specific place or standing and he speaks, come here, then the word here in the case is deictic expression which will show that the location of the speaker is away from the addressee. About the origin of the term deixis, that we already know that it has come from the Greek word and it is a borrowed term derived from Greek language which means pointing to. The property of language in which we study indexical, it is called indexicality, and the dexical terms which encode context are called deictics. Deictic words or deictics are a closed class, that is, there is a limited set of these words which can be used deictically, but some of them can also be used non-deictically. On the basis of semantic criteria, deixis can be classified in three major categories. We already know person, place and time, whereas Fillmore calls these three categories of deixis as major grammaticalized types. So we can say that deixis is a powerful way of positioning yourself subtly amongst the people you want to interact with in such a way that shows you can see things from their perspective. And it is very important to note that single lexical items such as I, here, now are part of a highly grammaticalized system and assume addressee knowledge of the identity. In the case of ch, the spatial location, in the case of here, and the temporal location in the case of now of the speaker. The meaning of deictic words change with the respect of position of the speaker and addressee, but the position of the speaker, it is more important. For example, come here, go there, etc. In such sentences, the active words here and there indicate the position of the speaker. So the references concerning the person, place and time can only be understood by an addressee who is able to reconstruct the speaker's point of view.